Hello everyone, I am your storyteller for today, and I'll be keeping you company. I know you use this video to help you fall asleep, so before that, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, where are you from? And what time is it where you are watching this? Get comfortable and relax. I need everyone here to understand something before I start. I am still living in this house. The mortgage papers were signed in April, and walking away would mean losing everything I put into this place. I was 34. Freshly divorced, and desperate for a clean slate when I found the listing online. The seller had just finished renovating the entire property, and the price was surprisingly reasonable for the neighborhood. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. A small fused-to-bargo house in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, where I could rebuild my life without constant reminders of my failed marriage. The inspection went smoothly. The paperwork cleared without issues, and by May, I was hauling boxes into what I thought would be my sanctuary. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I threw myself into unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know the neighbors. There was Mrs. Garrett next door, a retired nurse who brought me homemade brownies the day I moved in, and the Johnsons across the street with their 3 kids, who always waved when they saw me. The house itself was perfect. New hardwood floors, updated kitchen with granite countertops, fresh paint in every room. But something about the hallway between the kitchen and the master bedroom kept nagging at me. It was maybe 8 feet long, which seemed fine at first glance, but when I looked at the house from outside, the distance between those 2 rooms appeared much greater. I mentioned it to my brother, Kevin, when he came to visit, and he just shrugged it off, saying old houses have weird layouts sometimes. Still, every time I walked through that hallway, I found myself unconscious speeding up, like my body knew something my mind hadn't figured out yet. Everything changed on a Saturday morning in early June. I'd been having trouble with one of the outlets in that hallway. It kept sparking whenever I tried to plug in the vacuum cleaner. Rather than call an electrician for something so minor, I decided to fix it myself. I'd done basic electrical work before, helping my dad renovate rental properties when I was younger. After shutting off the breaker, I unscrewed the outlet plate and pulled the socket forward. That's when I heard it. A hollow echo when my screwdriver accidentally tapped against the wall behind. Not the solid thud you expect from drywall against studs, but an empty, almost metallic reverberation. I knocked on the wall with my knuckles, moving along the surface, and the hollow sound extended for at least 3 feet in both directions from the outlet. My first thought was maybe it was just poor construction. Perhaps the contractors had left too much space between the walls during the renovation. But the more I examined it, the stranger it became. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the gap where the outlet had been, and I could see that behind the drywall there was definitely empty space. Not just a few inches, but what looked like feet of darkness extending beyond what my light could reach. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the house, counting my steps, trying to match the exterior dimensions with what I knew of the interior layout. The math didn't add up. There should have been at least 6 more feet of space somewhere in that hallway area. I came back inside and stood in the hallway, running my hands along the walls, feeling for any irregularities, any signs of a door or panel that might have been covered over during the renovation. The decision to cut through the drywall wasn't made lightly. This was my house now, my investment, and I was about to deliberately damage it. But I had to know what was behind there. I started small, using a utility knife to cut a square about the size of a shoebox right where I'd heard the strongest echo. As soon as I pulled away that piece of drywall, stale air hit me. Not moldy or rotten, but old and undisturbed. Like opening a sealed container that had been closed 4 years, behind the wall was definitely a room. Narrow but deep. I enlarged the hole, cutting carefully until I had an opening big enough to squeeze through. The edges of the cut drywall were clean, and I could see this wall had been added recently. The studs were new. The insulation fresh. Someone had deliberately sealed this space during the renovation. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, making sure the video was recording in case I needed to document what I found, and squeezed through the opening. The hidden room was maybe 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, with bare concrete walls and a ceiling that was slightly lower than the rest of the house. The first thing that hit me was how organized everything was. This wasn't some forgotten storage space or construction mistake. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, positioned facing the wall I'd just come through. Above it, mounted on a bracket about 7 feet up, was an old camcorder, kind from the late 90s or early 2000s, with a small LCD screen that had long since gone dark. Cables ran from the camera down the wall, disappearing into a hole near the floor, but what really made me stop breathing for a moment was what lined the far wall. Metal shelving units, industrial looking, holding dozens of VHS tapes. Each tape had a white label. And as I got closer with my flashlight, I could read what was written on them in neat block letters: my address. 4827 Willow Drive, Ive. Every single tape had the same address but with different dates written underneath. I picked one up at random, asterisk 4827 Willow Drive, Eve, the 15th of March, 2017 asterisk. Another one read asterisk 4827 Willow Drive, Ive, the 3rd of September, 2015 asterisk. The dates went back years, some as far as 2012. I'd only owned this house for 2 months. The previous owner, according to the real estate agent, had bought it in 2022 and spent a year renovating before selling it to me. These tapes predated all of that. I grabbed several tapes, my mind racing with possibilities. Were these surveillance recordings? Had someone been watching the previous residents? The chair's positioning suddenly made horrible sense. Someone would sit here, facing the wall that separated this room from the hallway, possibly watching or listening to whoever lived in the house. I noticed small holes drilled through the concrete wall at various heights, each about the width of a pencil. When I shined my light through one, I could see straight through into the hallway. They opened up behind picture frames and the thermostat, things you'd never notice unless you were specifically looking for them. My legs felt weak as I realized that this room, this setup, had been deliberately concealed during the recent renovation. Someone had known it was here and had chosen to wall it off rather than remove it. But they'd left everything inside intact. I needed to see what was on those tapes. I grabbed an armful, maybe 15 or 20 of them, and carefully made my way back through the hole in the drywall. My hands trembled as I remembered I had an old Vicar in a box in the garage, something I'd kept from my marriage, thinking I might digitize some old family videos someday. It took me 20 minutes to find it and hook it up to the television in my living room. I started with the oldest tape I could find, dated the 8th of January, 2012. The screen flickered to life with that distinctive VHS quality, grainy and slightly warped. The image showed the interior of my house, but not my house as I knew it. Different furniture, different paint on the walls, but unmistakably the same rooms. The camera angle was from the hallway, looking into what was now my kitchen. A family was eating breakfast, a couple in their 40s and 2 teenage kids. They were just going about their normal morning routine, completely unaware they were being recorded. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching this family's life unfold in rapid motion. Nothing sinister happened, just regular daily activities. I ejected that tape and put in another from 2014. Different family, the house had been redecorated, but again, it was just people living their lives, oblivious to the camera. Then I tried a tape from 2016. This time the house was empty, but I could hear footsteps, and occasionally someone would walk past the camera's view. Always the same person, a man in his 60s wearing work clothes, like a maintenance worker or contractor. He would pause, sometimes stand in the hallway 4 minutes at a time, just breathing. On one tape from November 2016, I heard him speaking, though he wasn't visible on camera. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "They painted over the yellow again. The Brennans liked yellow. The new ones won't last long. They never do when they paint over the yellow." I had no idea who the Brennans were or what he meant about the yellow. The most recent tapes were what really disturbed me. Dates from 2022 and early 2023 showed the house during renovation, workers tearing down walls, installing new fixtures, painting, recorded from those hidden holes. But in between the construction footage, there were long periods where the house was empty except for one person, the same older man from the 2016 tapes. But now he looked frailer, more desperate. He would sit in that chair in the hidden room. I could tell by the audio quality and the echo. Trainate what was happening. "They're covering it all up now," he said in one recording from February 2023. 40 years of watching, and they're just going to pretend it never existed. But the room will still be here. The room remembers everything. In the last tape, dated just 1 week before the house went on the market. His voice was different, resigned. "The new one will find this eventually. They always get curious about the hallway. When you are watching this, know that I never meant harm. I just needed to document. Some houses have histories that shouldn't be forgotten. 27 Willow Drive has seen 7 families, 3 deaths, 2 births, and 1 murder swide-eyed that everyone pretends didn't happen. It's all here, all recorded. The truth of this place. I spent the entire night going through more tapes, and the picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. This man, he never learned his name, had somehow been accessing the house for decades, recording the private moments of every family who lived here. He had documented everything: arguments, celebrations, intimate conversations, children growing up, marriages falling apart. But more disturbing were his commentaries about each family. Predictions about how long they'd stay, observations about their habits and routines. He'd been right about most of his predictions. The Nuyans lasted exactly 13 months, just as he'd said they would. The Brennans left after their daughter disappeared, something he'd recorded, but never reported to anyone, and now here I was. The newest subject of this decade's long surveillance project. Living in a house where someone had watched and recorded every single person who'd ever called it home. I called the police that Sunday morning, but their response wasn't what I expected. 2 officers came out, looked at the room, watched some of the tapes, and told me that without evidence of current criminal activity, there wasn't much they could do. The recordings were old, the man in them unidentifiable, and technically no one was being harmed. They suggested I contact the previous owner, but when I did, he claimed complete ignorance about the room. He'd bought the house from an estate sale, he said, and had simply drywalled over what he thought was an old storage area without investigating it. The real estate agent was equally unhelpful. I even tracked down 2 of the families from the tapes. The Gunyans were living in Seattle now, and when I told them about the recordings, Mrs. Nguyen went completely silent before saying, "We always felt watched in that house." That's why we left. She wouldn't say anything more, and asked me not to contact them again. In the end, I made my decision. I hired contractors to completely demolish the hidden room, removing every trace of it: the chair, the camera mount, the shelving units. I kept the tapes, though they're in a storage unit across town. All of them. Because destroying them felt wrong somehow. Those recordings are the only proof that some of these events ever happened. Especially the things people want to forget. I had the holes in the walls professionally sealed and the entire hallway restructured, making it properly match the house's dimensions. The contractor who did the work told me he'd seen similar hidden spaces in old houses before, usually Prohibition-era hiding spots or Cold War shelters, but never one set up quite like this. It cost me nearly $10,000, but I sleep better now. Sometimes I still walk through that hallway and remember what was behind those walls. But at least now I know no one is watching. I check, though. Every few weeks, I tap on the walls, listening for hollow spaces, making sure no new holes have appeared, because the one thing that still bothers me, the thing that wakes me up some nights, is that I never found out who that man was or how he was getting in and out of that room for 40 years without anyone noticing. And sometimes, when I am lying in bed at night, I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, maybe in another house, sitting in another hidden room, watching another family who has no idea they're being wrecketed. Last month, I finally bought my first house in suburban Kansas. A massive colonial that seemed way too good to be true at just $180,000. The realtor, this overly cheerful woman named Diane, kept mentioning how the previous owner, Mr. Carlson, had suddenly relocated to Switzerland for work and needed to sell immediately. She showed me around the 4 bedrooms, the renovated kitchen with granite countertops, the huge backyard perfect for barbecues. And I remember thinking there had to be a catch somewhere, but the inspection came back clean. Just some minor electrical updates needed, and the neighborhood seemed quiet. With mostly families and retired folks, I've been cramped in studio apartments for 8 years since college, saving every penny while working as an IT consultant, and this felt like finally making it. The closing went smoothly, almost too smoothly, the seller's lawyer handling everything remotely. I got the keys on a Friday afternoon in late October when the leaves were just starting to turn. The first few days were perfect. Just me unpacking boxes and setting up my home office in what used to be a guest bedroom upstairs. I'd wake up to actual sunlight instead of my neighbor's television through thin walls. Make coffee in my own kitchen without stepping over roommates' shoes. And walk around planning where everything would go. On my 4th day there, I decided to really explore the basement since I needed to set up my workout equipment and maybe create a small workshop area. The basement was already partially finished with drywall on most walls and those interlocking foam floor tiles that the previous owner had installed, which saved me some money. But while measuring the space for my weight bench, I noticed the dimensions seemed wrong compared to the house's footprint above. Walking along the far wall with my tape measure, I discovered that behind a tall metal shelving unit full of old paint cans, there was another door. Painted the same beige as the walls, it had a heavy-duty deadbolt that definitely wasn't standard residential hardware. The door wasn't on any of the blueprints I'd gotten during closing, and trust me, I'd studied those papers like my life depended on it since this was my first major purchase. I pulled the shelving unit away from the wall, the metal legs scraping against the foam tiles and leaving black marks, and found myself staring at this weird, industrial-looking door with no handle. Just that massive made eco lock that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The paint job was sloppy around the edges, like someone had tried to make it blend in quickly, and there were scratch marks all around the deadbolt, as if previous attempts to open it had failed. I went back upstairs to check the disclosure documents again, spreading them across my kitchen counter next to a cold cup of coffee. But there was absolutely nothing about a storage room or safe room or whatever this was supposed to be. Diane's business card was still stuck to my fridge with a smiley face magnet from the previous owner, so I called her right away. But it went straight to voicemail with a generic message saying she was showing properties and would return calls within 24 hours. That night I barely slept. Just lying there in my new king-sized bed, thinking about that door and what could possibly need that level of security in a suburban basement. Around 3 a.m., I went back down with a flashlight, even though the basement had working lights, somehow needing that extra brightness while I examined every inch of the door frame. The wood around it was newer than the rest of the basement finishing, maybe installed within the last 2 years based on the color difference, and when I pressed my ear against the metal, it felt cold, much colder than it should have been for an interior door. I tried picking the lock with some old tools from a face in college when I thought lockpicking would be a cool hobby. But this lock was way beyond my amateur skills. The next morning, Saturday, I drove to Home Depot and bought a cordless angle grinder, safety goggles, and some cutting discs, telling myself I had every right to open any door in my own house, especially one that wasn't even supposed to exist according to the paperwork I'd signed. The grinding took longer than expected. Almost 40 minutes of showering sparks and metallic screeching that probably had my new neighbors wondering what kind of lunatic had moved in next door. I had to stop every few minutes to let the tool cool down and wipe the sweat from my forehead. Even though the basement stayed oddly cool for late October, when the lock finally gave way and clattered to the floor, bouncing twice on the foam tiles before rolling into a corner, I stood there for a solid minute just staring at the door. The metal was thick, maybe 2 inches, more like something you'd see in a commercial freezer or a bank vault. And as I pulled it open, the hinges groaned like they hadn't moved in months. The smell hit me instantly. This overwhelming mix of industrial bleach, layered with something else underneath. Something organic and wrong that made me immediately pull my shirt up over my nose. The room beyond was pitch black, and my flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up by the darkness until I found a pull, chain light switch just inside the doorway, when that single bulb flickered on, casting harsh shadows across maybe to 100 square feet of concrete space. I noticed the floor first because it was impossible to miss. Someone had scrubbed it recently. You could see the swirl patterns from aggressive mopping, but they couldn't hide the discoloration in the concrete itself, these dark, rusty stains that had soaked too deep to ever come clean. Against the far wall, too heavy, dainty chains hung from metal brackets that had been drilled directly into the concrete, each ending in what looked like professional-grade shackles, like all kind with actual locks built into them. The walls were bare concrete too, unpainted but covered in these weird scratches at about shoulder height, grouped in sets of 4 parallel lines like someone had been keeping count of something. There were clear imprints on the floor where furniture had been, a perfect rectangle about the size of a twin bed, a square that might have been a table, and circular marks from what could have been buckets or containers. In one corner, I spotted a drain in the floor, kind you'd see in a commercial kitchen or a morgue, dried brown residue caked around its edges. Despite someone's obvious attempts to bleach it clean, my legs went weak and I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. My mind racing through every possible innocent explanation but coming up empty. Because here is no good reason for chains and shackles in a residential basement, I backed out of the room slowly, like there might be someone still in there hiding in the shadows, and ran upstairs to grab my phone, nearly tripping on the basement steps in my panic. I called 911 and tried to explain what I'd found. But the dispatcher kept asking if there was an immediate emergency, if anyone was hurt, if I was in danger right now. And when I said no, she transferred me to the non-seat emergency line. The officer who answered sounded bored until I mentioned the chains and the stains. Then his tone shifted completely, and he said they'd send someone over within the hour. While I waited, I stood in my driveway, not wanting to be inside that house, watching normal Saturday activities on my street, kids riding bikes, someone mowing their lawn, an elderly couple walking their beagle, jerk wondering how many times they'd passed by while whatever happened in that room was taking place. 2 detectives arrived in an unmarked Crown Victoria, a younger black woman named Detective Washington, and an older white guy named Detective Brenner, who looked like he'd seen enough horrible things to last several lifetimes. They followed me to the basement, both of them putting on latex gloves before we even got to the door. And when Brenner saw the room, he immediately told Washington to call for a forensics team. They asked me to wait upstairs while they photographed everything, and I could hear them talking in low voices. Brenner saying something about checking missing persons from the last 5 years, and Washington responding with, "This looks exactly like the Riverside case." They sealed the room with yellow tape and told me I'd need to find somewhere else to stay for at least a week while they processed the scene. That this was now an active crime scene investigation. Brenner pulled me aside before they left and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Mr. Carlson during the sale. If I'd ever actually met him, and when I said everything was handled through lawyers, he exchanged a meaningful look with Washington that made my stomach turn to ice. I spent that night at a Holiday in downtown, unable to eat the takeout Chinese food I'd ordered. Just sitting on the bed watching the local news to see if my house would show up. Around 10 p.m., my phone rang. It was Detective Washington asking if I could come to the station first thing in the morning to look at some photographs. She wouldn't say what kind of photographs, just that it was important for their investigation, and her voice had this careful, measured quality, like she was trying not to alarm me more than necessary. I didn't sleep at all. Just stared at the ceiling thinking about those scratches on the wall, counting insets of 4. Wondering if they were days or weeks or something else entirely. At some point, I grabbed my laptop and searched for Mr. Carlson combined with my house's address, but found nothing except the property records showing he'd bought the place in 2022. Then I tried searching for missing persons in my area, and the results made me close the laptop immediately. 17 people reported missing within a 50-mile radius over the past 3 years. Mostly young adults who'd been traveling through or had recently moved to the area. The next morning at the police station, Washington led me to a small interview room with a two-way mirror and a stack of folders on the metal table. She opened the first folder and showed me a photograph of Mr. Carlson from his driver's license, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a completely forgettable face. The kind of person you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Then she showed me another photo. This one from a security camera at a hardware store dated 6 months ago, showing the same man purchasing bleach, tarps, and a set of heavy, dainty chains. The next photo was from a different store, showing him buying the exact same items, and Washington explained they'd found receipts for these purchases going back to years, always paid in cash. Always at different stores around the state. She asked if I recognized any of the people in the next set of photos. Young men and women, all smiling in what looked like social media pictures, all reported missing. And one of them, a guy named Brandon who disappeared 8 months ago, had been looking for cheap housing in the area according to his family. Washington didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. And she mentioned that the forensics team had found DNA evidence in that room from at least 4 different people. The story broke on the news that afternoon while I was still at the station. And suddenly, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from reporters, friends who'd seen the story. And my mother in Florida absolutely losing her mind. Washington told me they'd tracked Carlson's lawyer to a firm that didn't actually exist. Just a fake website and a rented mailbox at a Yoop store paid for with a prepaid credit card. The money from my house purchase had been wired to an offshore account that was emptied within hours of the transfer. And the supposed forwarding address in Switzerland was a vacant office building. They found Carlson's car abandoned at a rest stop near the Canadian border. Wiped clean of prints. With a receipt on the dashboard from a bus ticket paid in cash to Montreal, dated the day after I closed on the house. Inside the glove compartment, they discovered a burner phone with one saved video. A minute-long recording of that basement room with someone breathing heavily behind the camera. Panning slowly across the chains and the stains, while a muffled voice in the background pleaded repeatedly, begging, "Please, I have a family." The FBI got involved at that point, connecting my house to similar properties in 3 other states, where hidden rooms had been discovered after sales. All sold quickly below market value by different names that turned out to be aliases. They never found Carlson, Teef that was even his real name. And after 3 weeks of investigation, they released the house back to me. Professionally cleaned and with that door permanently welded shut. I couldn't bring myself to move back in. The thought of sleeping above that room made me physically sick. So I stayed with my parents while my lawyer fought to get the sale reversed, based on the failure to disclose what was essentially a crime scene. The other buyers from the connected properties formed a support group that I attended once. But hearing their stories, a woman found old Polaroids hidden in her walls. Another discovered human teeth in his garbage disposal, just made everything worse. Eventually, I took a massive loss and sold the house to a property developer who planned to demolish it and build condos. The only buyer who didn't care about its history. Before I handed over the keys, I went back one last time to grab a box I'd forgotten and found fresh flowers on the front steps with no card. Just white roses that reminded me of funeral arrangements. The demolition crew called me a month later, saying they'd found another room, smaller, behind a false wall in the garage. This one with children's drawings taped to the concrete. But by then, I'd already moved to a different state and changed my phone number, telling them to direct everything to the police. August was when I finally moved into my first house after years of apartment living. It was a modest Tabarson ranch in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where kids still rode bikes in the street and neighbors actually waved when they saw you. I've been working as a dental hygienist for 8 years, saving every penny I could. And finding this place felt like winning the lottery. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had passed away 6 months earlier, and his daughter was eager to sell quickly. She practically threw the keys at me during closing, mentioned something about needing to get back to California. And I never saw her again. The house needed work, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle with YouTube tutorials and determination. I remember thinking I'd finally made it, standing in that empty living room with sunlight streaming through dusty windows, inhaling that particular scent of old carpet and fresh possibilities. About 3 weeks after moving in, I first noticed the smell. It started subtle, like maybe I'd forgotten to take out the trash or left wet laundry in the machine too long teak sweet. Rotten odor that makes your nose wrinkle involuntarily. I deep cleaned everything that weekend. Scrubbed the kitchen until my kneecaws were raw, poured bleach down every drain. Even pulled out the refrigerator to clean behind it. The smell faded for maybe 2 days before creeping back, stronger this time. And I realized it was definitely coming from the heating vents. Every time the AC kicked on, this wave of stench would drift through the house, thick and cloying. Like spoiled meat mixed with something chemical. I bought those vent air fresheners, the ones that clip onto the grates. But they just made it worse, creating this horrific potpourri of lavender and decay. I tried everything over the next 2 weeks. Baking soda down the vents, those expensive enzyme cleaners they sell for pet odors. Even borrowed my brother's shop vac to suck out whatever might be stuck in there. Nothing worked. The smell would disappear for a few hours, then return with vengeance. Especially at night when the system cycled on automatically. I started sleeping with my windows open despite the humidity, preferring mosquito bites to that nauseating stench. My coworkers began asking if I was feeling all right because I looked exhausted. But how could I explain that a smell was keeping me awake? I called 3 different HVAC companies before finding one that could come out the same week. The first 2 were booked solid until September, and by that point, I was desperate enough to pay the emergency service fee for Comfort Zone heating and air. The technician, a younger guy named Craig with tattoo sleeves and gauged ears, showed up that Friday morning. Not what I expected from an HVAC tech, but he seemed to know his stuff immediately. Pulling out this tiny camera on a flexible cable to inspect the ductwork, I watched him feed it through the living room vent, staring at the grainy display on his tablet as it navigated the dark metal passages. He kept making these concerned humming noises, pausing occasionally to screenshot something on the screen. After about 20 minutes, he pulled the camera out and asked me where the main trunk line access was. Usually, it's in the basement or attic. Mine was in the crawl space under the house, accessed through a panel in the hallway closet. Craig grabbed his tools and a headlamp, muttering something about how he really hated crawl spaces, but needed to check where all the branch ducts connected to the main system. I heard him shuffling around down there for what felt like forever. The occasional clang of metal echoing up through the floor. Then everything went quiet for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Before I heard him scrambling back toward the access panel faster than someone should move in a 3-foot-high space. When he emerged, his face had lost all color, and there were cobwebs in his hair that he didn't even bother to brush away. He kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closing it again, his eyes darting between me and his phone. Finally, he managed to tell me there was something I needed to see. But first he had to get better lighting equipment from his van. The way he said it, careful and measured. Like he was trying not to spook a wild animal, made my chest tighten with dread. Craig returned with one of those portable work lights. The kind that floods a whole area with harsh white LED brightness, and we both descended into the crawl space. I'd never been down there before, and immediately understood why he hated these spaces. You had to duck, walk, or crawl. The dirt floor was covered in thick plastic sheeting that crinkled with every movement. And spiderwebs hung like curtains from every joist. The smell hit differently down here. More concentrated and mixed with earth and mildew. Craig led me about 15 feet in, where the main duct ran horizontally before branching off to different rooms. He positioned his light to illuminate a section where someone had cut a rectangular access panel into the duct, maybe 18 inches wide, sealed with metal tape that had been peeled back and reapplied multiple times based on the layers of adhesive residue around the edges. Craig pulled on thick work gloves and carefully peeled back the tape. The metallic ripping sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. The smell that escaped made us both gag and pull our shirts over our noses. He angled the work light to shine directly into the opening, and at first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The inside walls of the duct were covered in photographs, dozens of them, all held in place with yellowing Scotch tape. Some were Polaroids, others looked like they were printed from a computer. And a few were those old film prints with the white borders and dates stamped in orange numbers on the bottom. Craig reached in with a telescoping grabber tool and carefully removed one, holding it under the light. It showed my bedroom, taken from the exact angle where the vent would be, with my new bedding clearly visible. The photo couldn't have been more than 2 weeks old. My whole body went rigid as the implications sank in. Craig started pulling out more photos, laying them on the plastic sheeting in rows. There were pictures of every room in my house, all taken from vent height, spanning what looked like years based on the changing furniture and decorations. Some showed Harold's belongings from before he died, outdated wallpaper, and that floral couch I'd seen in the estate sale photos. Others showed the empty rooms during the selling period, but scattered throughout were recent ones. My coffee maker on the counter, my yoga mat rolled up in the corner of the living room, my work scrubs draped over the bathroom door. Someone had been documenting this house's interior for years. And they hadn't stopped when I moved in. Craig found more as he swept his light deeper into the duct. Photos of meals on the dining table, of mail stacked on the entryway console, of my laptop open on the couch. The worst part wasn't just the photos themselves, but what Craig discovered when he reached further into the duct with his camera. Behind where the photos were taped, someone had installed a series of small holes drilled through the bottom of the ductwork. Each one perfectly aligned with the vents in my rooms. They weren't original to the system. The metal shavings were still scattered inside, some rust-free and shiny, meaning some were recently drilled. Each hole was about the size of a nickel, just large enough for someone to feed something through. Craig pulled out his phone and started recording everything, telling me this was evidence for the police. He found something else too, strips of fabric, maybe torn from old clothes or sheets, that had been tied to thin wire and dangled through those holes into the vents. They were soaked with something dark and putrid, source of the smell. When Craig tugged on one wire, it ran along the entire length of the main duct, suggesting someone could pull these strips back and forth through the system from a single access point. We called the police from the Crawlspace because I refused to be alone in that house for even the few minutes it would take to get upstairs. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, though it felt like hours crouched there in the dirt with Craig. Both of us staring at that open duct like something might crawl out. The older officer, Detective Ruiz, immediately called for additional units and a forensics team when he saw the setup. They spent the next 6 hours documenting everything, removing all the photos as evidence, and discovering more modifications to the ductwork that neither Craig nor I had noticed. There were tiny mirrors positioned at certain angles, additional wiring that didn't belong to any HVAC system. And, in one section, what looked like a crude pulley system made from fishing line and paper clips. The detective kept asking me about Harold, his daughter, previous visitors to the house, anyone who might have had access during the estate sale or closing process. They never found who did it. The investigation revealed that the modifications to the ductwork went back at least 15 years, based on the different types of tape and materials used. Some of the oldest photos showed a family I didn't recognize. Presumably the people who lived there before Harold bought the place in 2008. Detective Ruiz had a theory that someone had been using the Crawlspace access for years. Possibly someone who had worked on the house at some point and kept a key or knew about a way in. They found evidence of a makeshift living area in the farthest corner of the Crawlspace. Energy bar wrappers, water bottles, a folded tarp that might have been used as bedding, the forensics team said based on the dust patterns. Someone had been there as recently as a few days before Craig opened that duct. They also discovered that one of the basement windows had been modified with a special latch that looked locked from the outside, but could be opened with the right tool. Whoever it was had probably been coming and going 4 years across multiple owners. Documenting the lives of everyone who lived above, I moved out that same night. Stayed with my brother and his family for 3 weeks, while I broke my lease and found a new place. The real estate agent understood given the circumstances, and Harold's daughter was horrified when the police contacted her. She remembered her father complaining about odd noises and smells in his final years. But everyone had attributed it to his declining health and mild dementia. The house is still on the market last I checked. Price dropped 4 times, and full disclosure required about what they found. Craig sent me a follow-up email saying he'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of HVAC work, and that he'd started checking Crawlspaces more thoroughly at every job. Sometimes I still think about those photos, wondering how many showed me unaware in my most private moments. And whether the person who took them is doing the same thing somewhere else now, in someone else's Crawlspace, documenting another life through the vents. I never thought digging up my backyard would change everything about how I see my own home. It was early May when I finally bought my first house, a modest two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Denver. After years of renting cramped apartments and dealing with impossible landlords, having my own place with an actual yard felt like winning the lottery. I was 28, working as a graphic designer for a local marketing firm. And my biggest worry at the time was whether I could afford new curtains for the living room. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Fosters, had left the place in decent shape. But the backyard was overgrown with weeds that reached almost to my knees. That Saturday morning, armed with gardening gloves and more enthusiasm than skill, I decided to tackle the jungle that would eventually become my vegetable garden. The soil was surprisingly soft from the spring rains, and I was making good progress clearing out the weeds near the back fence when my trowel hit something hard about 8 inches down. At first, I figured it was just another rock. I'd already found dozens of them, but when I brushed away the dirt, I saw a corner of clear plastic, the heavy-duty kind people use for freezer bags. Inside the plastic, I could make out something rectangular and black. My first thought was that maybe the Fosters had buried some old documents or valuables, though that seemed odd. I carefully dug around the package. which was about the size of a paperback book and wrapped multiple times in plastic bags sealed with duct tape. When I finally pulled it free and peeled away the layers, my heart started racing a bit faster. It was a smartphone, like of those newer Samsung models, completely pristine, like it had just come out of the box. The smart thing would have been to turn it into the police right away. But curiosity got the better of me. I mean, who buries a perfectly good phone in their backyard? The device was dead, obviously. But I had a drawer full of old charging cables from previous phones. After cleaning off the dirt and moisture from the plastic wrapping, I brought it inside and plugged it into my kitchen outlet. While it charged, I made myself a sandwich and tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe someone dropped it during a party, and the Fosters just accidentally buried it while doing yard work. But the deliberate wrapping made that theory fall apart. After about 20 minutes, the screen flickered to life with that familiar Samsung logo. The phone was locked, naturally requiring a PIN I didn't have. But what made me stop chewing mid-bite was the lock screen wallpaper. It was a photo of my house taken from the street, showing my bedroom window on the second floor. The timestamp in the corner of the photo showed a date from 2 weeks before I'd moved in, back when the house was supposedly empty, after the Fosters had already moved to their retirement community in Arizona. I stared at that screen until it went dark again, trying to process what I was seeing. The angle of the photo was specific. Taken from across the street, probably from the sidewalk near where Mrs. Jeffries, my neighbor, had her prized rose bushes. But what really made my skin prickle was a detail I hadn't noticed at first, in the photo. There was a shadow in my bedroom window, just the vague outline of someone standing there. Watching, I tapped the screen to wake it up again, zooming in as much as the lock screen would allow. That's when the phone vibrated with an incoming text message. The preview showed on the screen without needing to unlock it. "You shouldn't have moved back." Asterisk, I nearly dropped the phone right there in my kitchen. The message came from an unknown number, just a string of digits with a local area code. Before I could even think about what to do, another message popped up. "The garden remembers everything." Asterisk, then another. "Check under the oak tree next." Asterisk, my breathing got shallow and quick, and I had to sit down at my kitchen table to steady myself. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this had to be some kind of prank, or maybe messages meant for whoever owned this phone before. But how could anyone know I'd found it? How could they know I'd charged it right now? At this exact moment, I grabbed my own phone to take photos of the screen, documenting everything, when the buried phone started ringing. The caller ID just said "watching," and the ringtone was this old-fashioned bell sound that seemed way too loud in my quiet kitchen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, but no message was left. Within seconds it rang again, same caller ID. "Watching." This time, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I tried to swipe to answer. But the lock screen prevented me. The ringing stopped, and immediately a new text arrived. "You were always meant to find this. Check your laptop." Asterisk, that last message made my whole body go rigid. My laptop was closed on my coffee table in the living room, exactly where I'd left it that morning after checking emails. I walked over to it slowly, the buried phone still in my hand, and opened the screen. There was a folder on my desktop that hadn't been there before, labeled with just numbers. 5,042,024, that was today's date. Inside were dozens of photos. All of my house taken from different angles and at different times of day. Some showed me through windows carrying boxes on move, in day, cooking dinner last night. Even one from this morning showing me getting dressed in what I thought was the privacy of my bedroom. The most recent photo was time-stamped just 30 minutes ago. It showed me in the backyard, bent over the exact spot where I'd found the phone, taken from somewhere behind the fence. My neighbor Mrs. Jeffries was out of town visiting her daughter, and the house behind mine had been for sale 4 months. Whoever took this had to have been standing in the empty property. Watching me through the gaps in the wooden fence, I ran to my back door and locked it. Then went through the house, checking every window and door. Everything was secure, but that didn't make me feel any safer. The buried phone buzzed again. Your mother lived here in 1997. Did she tell you what she did? Asterisk, this message hit different than the others. My mom had never mentioned living in Colorado, let alone in this specific house. She'd always told me she grew up in Michigan and moved to Texas after college, where she met my dad. I called my mom immediately, trying to keep my voice steady. When she answered, I asked her casually if she'd ever lived in Denver before, maybe when she was younger. There was this long pause, the kind that tells you everything before words do. She finally asked me why I was asking. And when I mentioned the address of my new house, she went completely silent. After what felt like forever, she said we needed to talk, but not over the phone. She was booking a flight and would be there tomorrow morning. When I pressed her for answers, she just kept repeating that I needed to leave the house right now, stay in a hotel, and wait for her. The terror in her voice was something I'd never heard before. My mother, who was always the calmest person in any crisis, sounded absolutely petrified. Before hanging up, she made me promise not to dig anywhere else in the yard and to definitely not go near the oak tree in the back corner. But after that call, I couldn't just leave. I needed to understand what was happening. The buried phone kept receiving messages. She never told you about Nathan. He's been waiting. The oak tree grew from his guilt. Asterisk, each message made less sense than the last. But they painted a picture of something my mother had been running from for decades. I grabbed a flashlight. Even though it was still afternoon, somehow the house felt darker than it should. Through my kitchen window, I could see the oak tree my mom had warned me about. It was massive, probably 50 feet tall, with a trunk so thick I wouldn't be able to wrap my arms around it. The previous owners had built a small bench underneath it, and I'd actually eaten lunch there my first day in the house, thinking how peaceful it was. Now, looking at it from inside, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The ground around its base was slightly sunken, like the earth had settled unevenly over time. I was still staring at the tree when I heard footsteps on my front porch. Slow, deliberate steps followed by a knock. Not the doorbell. 3 measured knocks. Through the peephole, I saw a man, probably in his 60s, wearing a faded brown jacket despite the warm weather. He had this weathered face, like someone who'd spent decades working outdoors, and his eyes were this pale gray color that seemed to look right through the door. He knocked again, and when I didn't answer, he spoke. I know you are in there, Kathleen. That was my mother's name. His voice was rough but calm, like he'd practiced this moment many times. You look just like her. Same dark hair. Same way of standing with your weight on your left foot. I glanced down. He was right. I was leaning left. She thought changing her name to Amanda would make me stop looking. Thought moving to Texas would be far enough. But I've been here waiting, knowing someone would come back to this house eventually. The man stepped back from the door, and I watched through the peephole as he pulled out an old flip phone. My buried phone immediately buzzed with a new message. Nathan wasn't supposed to die. Your mother pushed him. Asterisk, another message. Asterisk, I am his brother. I saw everything from the upstairs window. Asterisk, my mind was racing, trying to piece together this nightmare. The man continued talking, his voice carrying through the door. She was 17, pregnant, scared. Nathan wanted to keep the baby, wanted to marry her, but Kathleen had other plans, didn't she? They argued by the oak tree that night. She said he fell, hit his head on a rock, but I saw her put her hands on his chest. I saw the push. He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily. My parents believed her story. Everyone did. Poor sweet Kathleen, the minister's daughter. They helped her bury him right there, under where that oak tree grows now. Helped her leave town, start fresh. But Nathan deserves justice. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But the man must have heard me because he said, "Go ahead, call them. I'll tell them about the body under the tree. I'll tell them who put it there. Your mother might have been a minor then. But murder has no statute of limitations." My finger hovered over the call button. Everything made horrible sense now. Why my mother had been so desperate for me to leave, why she'd hidden her past so completely. The man walked off my porch. But before leaving, he called out, "I buried that phone 2 weeks ago when I heard someone bought the house. Wanted you to understand what this place really is. I'll give you and Kathleen 24 hours to decide. Either she comes back and faces what she did, or I make sure everyone knows the truth about Nathan's death. The DNA testing they have now. That body will tell its own story." I watched him walk down my driveway and get into an old pickup truck. The license plate was from Nebraska, mud-covered but visible, as soon as his truck disappeared around the corner. I threw clothes into a bag and got in my car, calling my mom as I drove to tell her he'd found us. My mother met me at a diner halfway between Denver and the airport. When she walked in, she looked older than I'd ever seen her, like she'd aged years in the hours since our phone call. We sat in a corner booth, and she told me everything. She had been Kathleen Foster. Yes. Same last name as the elderly couple who'd sold me the house. They were Nathan's parents. The sick irony of me randomly buying that exact house wasn't random at all. Nathan's brother, Glenn, had been tracking our family for years through social media, public records. Little digital breadcrumbs we never knew we were leaving. When the house went on the market after his parents died, he'd somehow manipulated the listing, made sure it appeared in my searches. Even had someone at the real estate office steer me toward it. My mother explained that Nathan's death truly had been an accident. He'd been drunk, aggressive, grabbing at her when she tried to leave. She'd pushed him away in self-bestify, and he'd fallen backward, hitting his head on a garden stone. But in 1997, in a small religious town, a pregnant teenager's word against a dead boy's memory wouldn't have meant much. Nathan's parents had helped cover it up. Not to protect her, but to protect their own reputation. We went to the police together that night. My mother told them everything, and they took her statement with surprising compassion. Turns out Glenn had been harassing other people too. Nathan's old girlfriends, anyone connected to that time. The police had a file on him already. When they searched the property the next day, they did find remains under the oak tree. But the forensic evidence actually supported my mother's story. The angle of the skull fracture, the position of the body, consistent with a backwards fall. Glenn was arrested for stalking, harassment, and criminal trespass. He'd been living in that empty house behind mine, had installed cameras. Had been the shadow in my bedroom window that day he took the photo. The phone was his attempt at psychological torture. A way to make someone else feel the fear he imagined his brother had felt. My mother wasn't charged. The prosecutor said that even if they could prove manslaughter after all these years, she'd been a minor acting in self-bestify. I never went back to that house. Lost my down payment. But some things aren't worth salvaging. Mom and I are closer now, though. Secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. And finally, having the truth out, trash horrible as it was, somehow made us both free. The set-in first appeared on a Friday night while I was debugging a particularly nasty piece of code. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the only sounds in the house were my mechanical keyboard clicking away and the hum of my computer fans. That's when the headlights caught my attention through the office window. A black car had pulled up across the street and just stopped there. Not parked really, because the engine kept running. That low diesel rumble carrying through the quiet November air. The development was so new that the streets still had those orange plastic markers where the sidewalks would eventually go. And most of the lots were just dirt and construction debris. Only a handful of us had actually moved in. Scattered across the unfinished neighborhood like pioneers in a suburban wasteland. The isolation had been a selling point for me after everything that had happened with my divorce at first. I barely gave the car a second thought. People get lost in new developments all the time. The GPS doesn't know the roads yet. Street signs aren't up. House numbers are missing. Hell. I'd gotten turned around myself the first few nights coming home from the grocery store. But after an hour passed and that black sedan hadn't budged, I started watching it between lines of code. The headlights were dimmed down to parking lights, creating these to amber dots in the darkness like eyes. Through my blinds. I could just make out someone in the driver's seat, but they weren't moving around or looking at their phone. They were just sitting there facing my house, engine idling. The exhaust was creating little clouds of vapor in the cold air. Drifting up into the streetlight that flickered every few minutes, leaker only working one on our entire block around 1 a.m. I finally got up from my desk and went downstairs, turning off all the lights except the porch light. Maybe they'd think I'd gone to bed and leave. But when I peeked through the living room curtains, the set-in was still there. Engine still running, those parking lights still glowing. I could see the fuel gauge must have been dropping. Who just sits there burning gas for hours? The weird thing was the windows. They weren't tinted, not exactly. But they had this foggy quality, like they were covered in condensation from the inside. I grabbed my phone and snapped a photo. But the flash reflected off my window, ruining the shot. When I looked again without the phone, I swear the driver had shifted slightly, maybe turned their head just a fraction toward my house. It was hard to tell in the darkness, but that small movement made my chest tighten. I went back to bed around to am but kept getting up to check. Each time the car was there, same position, same dim lights, same running engine. The sound of it became this constant background drone that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Finally. Around 5 a.m., just as the sky was starting to lighten, I heard the engine rev slightly and looked out to see the sedan pulling away. Slow and deliberate, no rush at all. It didn't turn around or go to any of the other houses. It just drove straight down the road until it disappeared where the pavement ended and the construction zone began. I tried to get the license plate, but there was mud caked over it. Probably from driving through the unpaved sections of the development, that detail bothered me more than it should have. It seemed intentional. Saturday came and went without incident. I almost convinced myself it had been a one-the-sec time thing. Maybe someone casing the construction sites for tools or copper wire to steal. But that night, 11:30 p.m. sharp, I heard it before I saw it. Techno distinctive diesel engine sound crawling up the street. I rushed to the window and watched the same black sedan pull into the exact same spot. Like it was hitting a predetermined mark. I was ready with binoculars I dug out of a moving box. The driver was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a winter coat with the collar up. Even though it wasn't that cold. I couldn't make out facial features, but I could see their hands on the steering wheel. They were wearing those black leather driving gloves, the kind with the little holes over the knuckles. They never moved their hands, just kept them at perfect 10 and 2 position 4 hours. By the 4th night, I'd had enough. I called the non-SEEP emergency police line around midnight, explaining the situation to a bored-sounding dispatcher. She said they'd send a patrol car to check it out 20 minutes later. I saw the police cruiser approaching from the opposite direction. But here is the thing that still makes no sense to me. The second those police lights came into view, before they were even close, the sedan's engine went quiet. Not like it drove away, but like it had never been running at all. When the cops pulled up next to it, their spotlight revealed an empty car. No driver. The officers got out, walked around it, tried the doors, locked, ran the plates. They knocked on my door and told me the car was registered to someone named Walter Simmons who lived 3 towns over. They'd give him a call in the morning about abandoned property, when I insisted someone had been sitting in it just minutes ago. They looked at me like I'd been drinking. The cops left, but the sedan stayed, just sitting there, dark and silent now. Like a dead thing. I watched it for another hour, waiting for someone to come back to it, but nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won and I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. to use the bathroom and looked outside. The car was gone. No tow truck had come. I would have heard it. But what I found when I went to get my mail made my knees go weak. Fresh tire tracks in the frost-covered grass led from where the sedan had been parked, right up to my mailbox, not the driveway. But straight across Milan, like someone had driven up just far enough to reach the mailbox from their driver's side window. The tracks were deep, deliberate. Inside the mailbox, on top of my electric bill and some junk mail, was a folded piece of paper. Plain white, nothing special. The message was typed, not handwritten. "We're not watching you. We're waiting." Asterisk. I stood there in my pajamas and slippers, holding that note while my breath came out in quick puffs in the morning cold. Waiting for what? I looked around the empty development at all the half-built houses with their exposed lumber and tarred roofs. No one was around. No construction crews yet, no neighbors visible. I went inside and locked the door, then called the police again. The same dispatcher from the night before sounded even less interested when she heard my voice. She said I could come file a report if I wanted, but without any actual threat or crime. There wasn't much they could do. I took photos of the tire tracks and the note, then spent the rest of the day installing a security camera system I ordered with overnight shipping. The whole time I worked, I kept thinking about that word, waiting. It implied something was going to happen. Something they were expecting or preparing for. That night, 11:30 p.m. came and went with no sedan. I sat in my dark living room, watching the security camera feed on my laptop, but the street remained empty. Same thing the next night, and the next. After a week of quiet, I started to relax, thinking maybe the note had been some sick prank or the cameras had scared them off. I even laughed about it with my brother on the phone, calling it my weird suburban stalker phase. But on the 10th night, a Wednesday, something different happened. I was already in bed when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the cameras. I checked the feed and nearly dropped the phone. It wasn't the sedan this time. It was a white van, no windows in the back, parked in the same exact spot. But that wasn't what made me grab my baseball bat and creep downstairs. It was the fact that my porch light was on, and I knew, absolutely knew. I had turned it off before bed. I stood in my dark kitchen, peering through the window at that van. The engine was running just like the sit-in used to do, exhaust visible in the cold air. But this time I could see movement inside. Multiple shapes, maybe 3 or 4 people. They weren't trying to hide. One of them was holding something up to the windshield. And it took me a second to realize it was a camera with a long lens, pointed directly at my house. My security system was recording them while they were recording me. The thought made me feel sick, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted game. Then the side door of the van slid open, and someone stepped out. They were wearing dark clothes and a ski mask, but it was their walk that terrified me. Casual, unhurried. Like they were just out for a stroll. They walked to the edge of my property, stopped at the exact point where my lawn met the street, and just stood there waiting. I called 911 this time. Not the non-C emergency line. I told them someone in a ski mask was standing at the edge of my property. That there was a van full of people watching my house. The dispatcher said units were on the way. Stay inside. Don't confront them. But as I waited, phone in one hand and bat in the other, the masked figure suddenly raised their arm and waved at me. A slow, deliberate wave. Like they could see me perfectly in the dark kitchen. Then they turned and walked back to the van, got in. And the vehicle pulled away at a normal speed. No rush, no panic. They turned left at the end of the street, heading toward the finished part of the development. When the cops arrived 8 minutes later, I showed them the security footage. Clear as day, there was the van, The person in the mask, everything I described. The officer, a younger guy named Daniels, actually looked concerned. He called for backup, and they searched the neighborhood for the van. They found it 2 streets over, parked in the driveway of an empty house that was for sale. The van was unlocked, keys in the ignition, engine still warm. Inside, they found professional camera equipment, dozens of photos of my house from different angles and times of day, and a folder with printouts from public records, my name, my divorce filing, my mortgage information, everything you could find online if you knew where to look, but the most disturbing thing was a calendar with dates marked in red. Starting from the day I moved in, every night the sedan had appeared was circled, and at the bottom of this month's page, someone had written package arrives tomorrow with an arrow pointing to that day's date. The police took everything as evidence and told me they'd have a patrol car stationed on my street for the next few nights. Officer Daniels gave me his card and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with every light in the house on, watching the patrol car parked outside, refreshing the security camera feed every few minutes. Around 4 nothing had happened, and I started to wonder what kind of package they were expecting. Was I the package? Was someone coming to get me? Then, at exactly 6 a.m., I heard it. The rumble of a large truck. I rushed to the window to see a moving truck pulling up to the empty house 3 doors down from mine. 2 men got out and started unloading furniture like it was the most normal thing in the world. Behind the moving truck, a silver SUV parked, and a family got out, a couple with 2 young kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old. The woman waved at the patrol officer who had gotten out to watch. She walked over to him, and I could see them talking. Her gesturing at the house, smiling. Normal new neighbors moving in. Except I recognized her walk immediately. It was the same gait, the same shoulder movement as the masked figure from the night before. The patrol officer eventually drove away after helping them carry a couch inside. I stood at my window watching this family move in, feeling like I was losing my mind. Then the woman looked directly at my house and waved that same slow, deliberate wave. I grabbed my phone to call Officer Daniels, but stopped when I saw a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of me, taken from inside my own bedroom 2 weeks ago, showing me sleeping. The timestamp was from the first night the sedan had appeared. The message below it read, "We waited for the right house to become available. We're home now. Stop calling the police, or we'll have to introduce ourselves properly. Some neighbors just want privacy." I packed a bag and left within an hour. Stayed in a motel for 3 days while I arranged to break my lease. The property management company charged me a fortune in fees, but I didn't care. I drove past once to get the rest of my things, and that family was outside playing in their yard. The woman smiled and waved. I never went back. The gravel trucks woke me up every morning at 6:15 sharp, dumping their loads in the empty lots around my house, while I tried to make coffee in a kitchen that still smelled like fresh paint and sawdust. Southern Illinois in February isn't exactly paradise, especially when you are living in what's basically a construction zone pretending to be a neighborhood. Only 5 houses stood completed in the entire development, scattered across 200 empty lots like forgotten game pieces on a board nobody wanted to finish playing. Mine sat at the edge of everything, backed up against a field of dead corn stalks that rattled in the wind at night. The construction crews treated my driveway like their personal parking lot during the day, their music blasting from truck radios while they framed houses that wouldn't have families in them 4 months. But after 5 o'clock, when their trucks rumbled away down the unfinished access road, the silence would roll in thick and heavy, broken only by the plastic sheeting that snapped against the skeletal frames of half-built homes whenever the wind picked up. I'd been there 16 days when the watching started, though I didn't know that's what it was at first. That Monday night, a sound pulled me from sleep, deliberate, measured crunching on the loose gravel outside my bedroom window. Not the scattered noise of a raccoon or stray dog, but something with purpose, with weight behind each step. Through the gap in my curtains, I saw her standing at the property line where my temporary orange mesh fence met the emptiness of the next lot. A woman in a heavy coat that hung past her knees, dark hair matted against her skull like wet newspaper. Just standing there in the darkness facing my house. The security light from the model home 3 lots down barely reached her, casting just enough glow to show she wasn't moving, wasn't swaying, wasn't doing anything except standing perfectly. Unnaturally still with her arms hanging straight at her sides, like someone had positioned her there and walked away. I watched her for maybe 10 minutes, waiting for her to do something, anything, check a phone, shift her weight, turn her head, but she remained frozen in place like she'd grown roots into the gravel. The logical part of my brain kept suggesting explanations. Maybe she lived in one of the other finished houses and couldn't sleep. Maybe she was having some kind of episode. Maybe she was drunk and confused about where she lived. But none of that explained why she picked my fence, my window. Or why she stood with that terrible stillness that made my chest tight with a fear I couldn't name. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back to bed, pulling a pillow over my head to muffle the sound of wind through the corn stalks. When my alarm went off at 7, I immediately checked the window. She was gone. But the gravel where she'd stood looked disturbed, pressed down into perfect boot prints like someone had stood there 4 hours shifting, just enough to sink into the stones. The next night I stayed awake on purpose. Laptop open on my bed, pretending to work on spreadsheets while really watching the window. Around 1:40, the crunching started again. Slower this time, more deliberate, like someone savoring each step. She appeared at the fence line first, that same heavy coat making her look like a dark pillar against the empty lot. But then she started walking forward, not toward my front door or driveway, but straight toward my bedroom window, stopping maybe 10 feet away. This time close enough that I could see her face wasn't young or old, just weathered in a way that made it hard to place her age. Her eyes stayed fixed on my window even though my lights were off and she couldn't possibly see me through the curtains. She stood there until 4 in the morning, never blinking that I could tell. Never moving except for this barely visible rising and falling of her shoulders as she breathed. The worst part was her mouth. It hung slightly open, just enough to see the glint of teeth. Like she was about to say something but had forgotten how to form words. Wednesday night she stood 5 feet from my window, close enough that her breath fogged the glass in little bursts that caught the moonlight. I could see details I wished I couldn't. Dirt caked under her fingernails even though her hands never moved from her sides. A dark stain on the collar of her coat that looked old and set in like rust or dried blood, and her eyes, which I realized weren't actually looking at my window, but through it. Focused on something beyond the wall like she could see straight into my bedroom. I called the police that night, whispering into my phone while she stood there breathing against my window. They sent a patrol car around 3:30. And when the headlights swept across my yard, she simply turned and walked into the empty lot, disappearing between the lumber stacks and porta potties before the officer even got out of his vehicle. He knocked on my door, took some notes about a suspicious person, and suggested maybe it was someone from the construction crew checking on equipment. The dismissive way he said it, like I was some paranoid suburban woman afraid of her own shadow, made me want to grab his shoulders and make him understand that no construction worker stands at windows 4 hours without moving. The officer left me his card and told me to call if she came back. But we both knew he thought I was wasting his time. After he drove away, I walked around my house with a flashlight checking the windows, and that's when I found them, boot prints in the gravel. Dozens of them, circling my entire house like she'd been walking rounds while I slept. But the thing that made my knees go weak was realizing the prints went right up to every window, not just my bedroom. She'd stood at each one, and at the sliding glass door that led to my back patio, the prints were deeper. Like she'd stood there the longest, Some of the prints overlapped, creating this chaotic pattern that reminded me of dance steps or someone pacing while working through a problem in their head. I followed them with my flashlight until they led to the edge of my property, then continued in a straight line through the empty lot, past the construction equipment, and disappeared into the darkness where the streetlights hadn't been installed yet. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Just sat in my living room with every light in the house blazing and a kitchen knife on the coffee table that I knew wouldn't help but made me feel less helpless. When the construction crews rolled in that morning, I practically ran outside to talk to the foreman, a guy named Vince who always had drywall dust in his beard and a Red Bull in his hand. I told him about the woman, showed him the boot prints that were already being scattered by workers walking through them, and asked if any of his crew had seen someone matching her description hanging around the site after hours. Vince scratched his beard, leaving white streaks on his cheek, and called over 2 of his guys who'd been there the latest the night before. They hadn't seen anyone, but one of them, a younger guy with paint-stained jeans, mentioned finding weird stuff around the site recently. Tools moved from where they'd been left, lunch coolers opened and searched through. And strangest of all, someone had been using the porta-potty in the middle of the night, but leaving muddy boot prints all over the seat, like they'd been standing on it to look out the ventilation slot at the top. The foreman promised to keep an eye out and said he'd have security check the site more often. But I could tell he was just humoring me, like the cop had that night. Friday, I set up my laptop to record through the window, thinking if I had proof, someone would have to take this seriously. The woman showed up earlier than usual, around 11:30. And this time she didn't stop at 5 feet or even 3 feet from my window. She pressed herself against the glass, her palms flat against it, leaving greasy prints as she slowly dragged them down. Her mouth moved constantly now. Not like she was talking, but like she was chewing something, working her jaw in these exaggerated motions that made her whole face contort. I could hear her through the glass, not words. Just this wet, rhythmic sound like someone eating soup with their mouth open. She stayed like that for 6 hours straight, never taking her hands off the glass, never stopping that horrible chewing motion. And when she finally pulled away just before dawn, she left behind not just handprints, but a long smear of saliva on the window where her mouth had been pressed against it. Saturday morning, I packed a bag and decided to stay at a motel for the weekend. But first I needed to show someone the recording. The laptop had captured everything, her approaching in the darkness, pressing against the window, those 6 hours of her standing there making those wet sounds with her mouth. But when I tried to email the file to my sister, to the police, to anyone, the video showed up corrupted on their end, just static and digital noise, teen, though it played fine on my laptop. The police officer from Wednesday, when I called him directly, said without evidence there wasn't much they could do except increase patrols. And I could hear in his voice that he'd already written me off as another anxiety case. I drove to the motel anyway, paid for tonight's, and tried to convince myself that maybe she was just some mentally ill homeless woman who'd fixated on my house for whatever reason. That she was harmless, just confused. But I kept thinking about those boot prints on the toilet seat, about her standing on it to watch the construction site, to watch my house from a different angle, planning something I couldn't understand. Sunday night I couldn't stand it anymore. The not knowing was worse than facing whatever she wanted. I drove back to the house around 10 o'clock, parked down the street where she wouldn't see my car, and crept through the empty lots toward my backyard. The construction site felt different in the darkness. All those half-built frames looking like skeletons reaching up from the ground. And every sound made me want to run back to my car, but I needed to see what she did when she thought I wasn't there. I positioned myself behind a stack of lumber where I could see my bedroom window clearly. And I waited. She came at midnight exactly, but not from the direction I expected. She emerged from inside the unfinished house directly behind mine, crawling out through what would eventually be a kitchen window. She'd been in there the whole time, maybe 4 days, just 30 feet from where I slept. This time she didn't just stand at my window. She tried the locks on my doors, ran her fingers along the window frames looking for weak points, and even climbed onto my roof to check the attic ventilation. I recorded everything on my phone this time, making sure to save it to the cloud immediately. And that's when I noticed something that made everything click into place. When she climbed down from my roof, she pulled something from her coat pocket, a realtor's lockbox key. The kind they use for showing houses. She went to the unfinished house next door, opened the temporary door with practiced ease, and disappeared inside. I heard drawers opening, the sound of running water even though the plumbing wasn't connected yet, and realized she'd been living in these shells of homes for who knows how long, moving from one construction site to another, using the empty houses like her personal network of hiding spots. The next morning, Monday, when the crews arrived, I was already there with my phone, showing Vince and then the police the video of her with that lockbox key. Turns out she was a former real estate agent named Judith Harmon, who'd lost her license 3 years ago after multiple complaints about her entering clients' homes without permission, standing in their bedrooms while they slept, leaving strange items in their dresser drawers, locks of hair, teeth, fingernail clippings, things that belonged to other people. The police found her that afternoon in the unfinished house behind mine, surrounded by notebooks filled with detailed observations about me and the other residents. When we left for work, when we turned our lights off, which windows we left unlocked, what we threw in our garbage, she documented everything in tiny, cramped handwriting that covered every inch of paper, even the margins. They also found my missing mail, some clothes I thought the dryer had eaten, and dozens of photos of me taken through my windows that she'd printed out at the library and annotated with times and dates. She didn't resist when they arrested her, just kept making that chewing motion with her mouth, and as they led her past me to the patrol car, she finally spoke. Her voice came out hoarse and wet, like she hadn't used it in weeks. "Your house settles at 215. The bedroom window lock jiggles if you pull up twice then push. You look so peaceful when you sleep on your left side." They found out later she'd been inside my house at least 3 times while I slept, just standing in my doorway watching. The construction company changed all their lockboxes the next day, and I broke my lease that same week. But sometimes I still wake up at 2:15 exactly and listen for the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. It started on a quiet weekend after we'd finally settled into that old rental house near the edge of town. My roommate, Claire, and I had just finished our second semester at community college and were desperate for something cheap enough to split. The house looked fine from the outside, small, beige siding, creaky porch, but the rent was suspiciously still. When you are living off part-time paychecks and instant noodles, you take what you can get. We convinced ourselves the uneven floors and that faint musty smell were just signs of character. The landlord, a man named Mr. Henley, barely said 10 words during the walk-through. He handed us the keys, muttered something about the place being old but sturdy, and left before I could ask about the patch of fresh paint behind the laundry area. We didn't think much of it then. Over the next week, we tried making the house feel like ours. We hung string lights, deep cleaned every surface, and laughed about how creepy it felt at night when the pipes groaned. But there was always this utensil, stay loader that no amount of air freshener could cover. One Saturday morning, Claire decided to move the washing machine to clean behind it. The thing was ancient, rusted around the base, and it took both of us straining to push it forward. When we finally did, a puff of dust rose into the air, and that's when I noticed the outline of a small square panel on the wall. The paint around it was a slightly different color, like someone had covered it hastily. A tiny padlock dangled from LA near the bottom. Claire tapped on it with her knuckle, and the hollow sound that came back sent a strange chill through me. We didn't have the key, obviously, but Claire was determined to see what was behind it. She grabbed a flathead screwdriver and started working the lock loose while I held the flashlight. The metal creaked, scraped, and finally snapped open after several tries. When she pulled the panel off, stale air rushed out, cold and heavy, like it had been sealed for years. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The flashlight beam cut into the darkness, revealing what looked like a pile of fabric and plastic deep inside. For a second, I thought it was just old insulation or junk from the previous tenants. Then I saw a blanket, wrinkled and still shaped like someone had just been lying under it. Claire thought it was hilarious at first, joking that we'd found a secret bunker. She shoved the flashlight further inside while I crouched beside her, half curious, half uneasy. The beam landed on scattered items, a crumpled fast food bag, an empty water bottle, a stack of magazines warped from moisture. None of it looked decades old. I remember noticing the expiration date on a granola wrapper. It was from only a few weeks earlier. My laugh came out short and nervous. Claire didn't say anything after that. She just stared deeper into the darkness, like she expected something to move. We argued quietly about whether to go in. Claire said we should check it out, that it was probably a raccoon nest or some drifter's stash from before we moved in. I didn't like either option. Still, she convinced me to at least shine the light around once more. When she reached her arm in farther, her voice trembled slightly as she said, "T, here is a blanket down here, and it's warm." That word, warm, didn't make sense. The crawl space had to be freezing. I took the flashlight, leaned closer, and saw it for myself. A faded blue blanket bunched up like a cocoon, a dent in the middle where someone's body might have rested not long ago. We both backed away, leaving the panel open. The air in the laundry room suddenly felt heavier, like the walls were holding their breath. Claire wanted to call the landlord, but I insisted we call the police first. She hesitated, worried we'd sound ridiculous. But the idea of that warm blanket sitting there made my voice crack when I told her I wasn't spending another minute in that room. While she called, I stood in the hallway staring at the washing machine we'd pushed aside, expecting to hear something crawling beneath the floorboards. The police arrived faster than I expected, two officers who looked equally tired and skeptical. One of them crouched down, shined his own flashlight inside, and whistled quietly. The other asked if we'd noticed anything missing or disturbed. We hadn't. They crawled in with masks and gloves, spending maybe 10 minutes inside before emerging. Their faces had changed. They found a backpack half filled with clothes, a toothbrush, and a small radio still tuned to a static-filled station. The officer said whoever had been living there probably slipped out once they heard us moving the washer. He didn't sound sure. Though that night, Claire couldn't sleep. Every sound made us jump. House settling, a branch brushing the siding, the faint hum from the refrigerator. The officers had promised to send someone by to check the property again in the morning. But that didn't make either of us feel better. Before going to bed, I stacked a chair under the back door handle and kept a kitchen knife beside the mattress. The crawl space panel was still open. The police said to leave it like that just in case. The idea that someone might have been slipping in and out beneath our feet made the air feel unsafe, like even the floor couldn't be trusted. Around 3 in the morning, Claire whispered my name from her room. Her voice sounded tight, almost strangled. I rushed in, and she pointed to her window. The curtain was moving, not from wind, but slow, steady movement, as if someone had brushed past it. We stood frozen for what felt like forever until we heard a soft scrape outside. Then footsteps fading toward the back fence. When the police came again, they found fresh prints in the dirt behind the laundry room. Whoever it was, they'd circled back. By the next afternoon, we packed our things. Mr. Henley didn't seem surprised when we told him why we were leaving. He just sighed. Said, "Happens sometimes with these older homes. and offered to refund half the month's rent. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. Someone had lived there before, maybe without his permission. Maybe not. He'd chosen to ignore it. As we loaded the last box into the car, I saw the crawlspace still open. The shadows inside looking deeper than they should have been. A few weeks later, the police called. They'd found signs of multiple entries under the house, handmade shelves, scattered clothes, and a sleeping bag buried under the floorboards near the kitchen. No fingerprints matched anyone in their system. They said whoever had been there probably moved on, but sometimes I dream about that blanket, the dent where a body used to be, and how the air that came out felt alive. It's been years, and I still can't do laundry in silence. Every time I hear the machine hum, part of me wonders if something underneath is listening back. The first night in the new house felt heavier than I expected. Not bad, just heavier, like the air carried something old that hadn't moved in a long time. My wife, Erin, had already unpacked most of the kitchen while our son, Luke, ran around testing every light switch he could find. The place was bigger than our old town house and had that creaky charm she loved. Around midnight, when the boxes finally stopped calling for attention, I stepped out to the backyard to breathe a little. That's when I saw it. The faintest orange glow leaking through the attic vent above the garage. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from the streetlights or maybe one of Luke's glow toys misplaced somewhere. The glow pulsed softly, barely visible unless you stared. The thing was, I had checked that attic earlier that day. It was empty, or at least I thought it was. The switch at the bottom of the pull-down ladder didn't even work. I remember twisting it back and forth, muttering about calling an electrician. Yet there it was, a low, steady light that shouldn't have been there at all. Erin brushed it off when I mentioned it the next morning. Probably leftover wiring, maybe something old still connected, she said, sipping her coffee. Logical, sure. But that didn't sit right. We'd barely moved in 2 days earlier, and the inspection had shown the attic light disconnected entirely. Still, I climbed up there again that afternoon, flashlight in hand, expecting to find a frayed wire, or maybe some leftover bulb catching sunlight. Instead, I found nothing. Just dusty insulation, some nails sticking out of the beams, and the faint smell of wood rot. That night the glow returned. A little brighter this time, more defined. Erin was asleep beside me when I noticed it again through the blinds. I stared at that vent until my eyes adjusted to the dark, trying to make sense of it. Curiosity won over sleep. So I grabbed a jacket, went outside, and craned my neck upward. The light was steady, like a lantern flame behind the vent screen, flickering just enough to tell me it was real. I climbed the ladder quietly, not wanting to wake Erin or Luke. The wood groaned under my weight, and each step sent a puff of dust floating through the beam of my flashlight. When I reached the top, I half expected to find nothing again, just shadows and cobwebs. But this time there was a soft orange halo spreading across the far corner. I held my breath and moved closer. Sitting on the plywood floor was a small camping lantern, metal handle, dented body, flickering weakly as if it had been on 4 hours. Next to it were 2 open cans of chili and an old blanket rolled up against the insulation. The smell hit me then. Stale sweat and something metallic. I nudged the cans with my foot. They were still sticky, maybe a day or 2 old. The lantern's battery light blinked faintly when I picked it up, like it was about to die. Every instinct told me I shouldn't be there alone, but I kept looking around, sweeping the light across the rafters. In the dust near the vent, I saw it, a line of footprints leading to the far end. Then vanishing behind a wooden beam where the insulation had been peeled back, I called the police before even waking Erin. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the attic darkness like spotlights. One of them, Officer Hall, crouched by the beam end, pulled the insulation aside. Behind it, Hidden under a loose sheet of plywood was a small opening leading outside, gaps just wide enough for someone to squeeze through, he muttered. Right behind the gutter. They checked the perimeter and found flattened grass and a small pile of trash tucked near the downspout. Empty water bottles, food wrappers, even a toothbrush. When they came back inside, Hall said whoever it was had probably been living up there for weeks, maybe longer. The thought made my chest tighten. Erin stood at the bottom of the ladder holding Luke, who clung to her shirt, half asleep, but sensing something was wrong. The officer took our statement, said they'd patrol the area for a few nights, and left us with a strange kind of silence. The attic light never came on again after that night. But sometimes, when the wind hits the roof just right, I still hear faint creaks above our bedroom. Too soft to be certain. Too familiar to ignore. 4 weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly, just small things that built up and wouldn't let go. I'd find scuff marks on the inside of the garage door or crumbs near the storage shelf we rarely used. Erin tried to reassure me, saying it was just left over from the move, but deep down I knew better. Whoever had been hiding up there hadn't just stumbled in for a night, they'd made themselves comfortable. There were drawings on one of the insulation panels to crudely sketched stick figures of a man, woman, and child standing beneath a triangle that looked eerily like our house. I replaced the attic ladder lock the next morning and sealed the gap behind the gutter myself, hammering in new boards until my palms blistered. The work gave me something to focus on, but the more I tried to forget, the stranger things felt around the house. Some mornings the air would smell faintly of burnt metal when I opened the attic hatch. Even though the space was sealed, one night the hallway motion light turned on by itself around 3 a.m. And the dog, our usually fearless retriever, stood staring up at the ceiling, growling low like it recognized something I couldn't see. A few days later, Officer Hall stopped by again to check in. He told me they'd caught a man nearby, breaking into an abandoned house just 2 streets over. He matched the description neighbors had mentioned, mid-30s, gaunt, wearing a torn work jacket. In his backpack, they'd found a small battery lantern and a photo torn in half showing a woman and kid. Hall didn't say it outright, but I think he suspected the guy had been living in multiple attics around the area. "You'd be surprised how many houses have spaces big enough for that," he said before leaving. That sentence stuck with me. We've been in that house almost a year now, and things have mostly gone back to normal. Still, I catch myself glancing up at the vent every night before bed, expecting that dim orange flicker to appear again. It never has. But the memory of it, quiet pulse of light in a place that should have been dark, stays with me. Sometimes I wonder what he watched, what he heard while we lived below him. Laughing and arguing and making dinner like nothing was wrong. Maybe that's the part that unsettles me the most. Knowing that 4 weeks, our lives were someone else's secret show. The house felt too cheap to be real, to floors. A creaky staircase, a front porch big enough for a swing, and somehow it was still within our budget. My girlfriend, Melissa, said it had character, which was her way of saying she could picture us growing old there. I just saw the cracked paint, the sagging gutters, and the faint smell of dust that never quite left the air. But we signed the papers anyway, thinking it would be fun to fix it up together. We moved in midweek with a U-Haul, pizza boxes, and way too much optimism. By the second day, we'd already started exploring the upstairs. There were 3 doors in the hallway. One led to our bedroom, one to a small bathroom, and the last was sealed shut. Not just locked, but screwed in place with thick, rusted bolts across the frame. Whoever had to knit it wasn't trying to keep people out. It looked more like they were trying to keep something in. Melissa thought maybe it was a safety thing, some old renovation shortcut. I remember joking that we just found our haunted room, though saying it out loud didn't feel as funny as I expected. It took us about an hour to pry the screws loose. The wood groaned like it hadn't been touched in years, and when the door finally gave, a wave of stale air poured out. Inside was a small square room, barely big enough for a crib or a desk. And the walls were freshly covered in light blue wallpaper, with tiny clouds printed across it. It didn't match the rest of the house at all. In the corner, an old baby monitor was still plugged into the outlet. The little red light on the receiver faint but alive. It was eerie, like someone had just been there. Melissa unplugged it right away and tossed it on the dresser in our bedroom. We didn't talk much about the room after that. She suggested painting over the wallpaper, maybe turning it into storage once we cleaned it out. But that night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of faint static, techno. Constant hiss that you recognize instantly if you've ever used a baby monitor. The one we'd left unplugged was glowing again. Sitting on top of the dresser, the light steady and red. At first, I figured Melissa must have plugged it back in without telling me, maybe just curious to see if it still worked. But when I asked her the next morning, she swore she hadn't touched it. The cord was still twisted from where she'd yanked it out the day before, and the plug itself looked bent. I checked the outlet and realized the monitor wasn't even connected to the wall anymore. It was dead. Yet that tiny red light had been glowing in the dark. I didn't say anything else. We both just kind of brushed it off, pretending it didn't matter. Later that afternoon, we tried to keep ourselves busy fixing the kitchen shelves. But I couldn't stop glancing toward the stairs. Every creak, every soft sound coming from above made me think about that little room. Around dusk, Melissa went up to grab her phone charger. And I heard her call my name. Her voice was shaky, but not quite scared. Not yet. I went up. And she pointed to the baby monitor on our dresser. The receiver had turned on again. This time flashing green like it was picking up sound only, there was no transmitter. The one we found in the small room was still lying unplugged inside a cardboard box downstairs. That night, we decided to leave the monitor outside on the porch, just to make sure we weren't losing our minds. Around midnight we heard it again. Faint static through the house, like it was trying to speak through the walls. I went out and checked the porch. The monitor was still there, light dead. When I came back upstairs, Melissa was sitting up in bed, pale and silent. The sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from our bedroom. Soft and rhythmic like breathing through a speaker. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in an empty house. We didn't sleep much after that. I turned on every light upstairs and checked every room, even the attic hatch. Nothing. The air felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the blanket while I unplugged the monitor again and wrapped the cord around it until it stopped blinking. Just before dawn, I swear I heard a baby's faint laugh coming from that sealed room. Short, quiet, almost playful. Followed by a sharp crack from inside the wall, like someone knocking from the other side. The following morning, sunlight made everything seem less threatening, but Melissa wanted that room sealed again. I didn't argue. We borrowed a drill from the neighbor, and I screwed the bolts back in place exactly where they'd been. The wallpaper inside had started to peel at the corners overnight, revealing faint scribbles beneath. Childish shapes drawn in crayon. When I touched one, the paper tore, and underneath I could see another layer of paint pink. Must have been a nursery before someone covered it up. The air inside still smelled faintly sweet, like baby lotion gone sour. That evening we took the monitor to the dumpster at the end of the street. I watched it hit the bottom and made sure it stayed there. We both tried to move on, focusing on repainting the downstairs walls and ignoring the noises that still creaked through the ceiling. But a week later, I came home from work and found the screws on the locked door slightly loosened, like someone had been turning them from the inside. I told myself it was just the wood shifting, but deep down I didn't believe it. 2 nights after that, Melissa shook me awake around 3 in the morning. She didn't say a word, just pointed toward the baby monitor sitting on her nightstand. It was identical to the one we'd thrown away, same model, same scuffed plastic casing. Same faint red light glowing steady in the dark. Neither of us moved for a long time. Eventually, I walked over, unplugged it, and took it straight outside. I left it on the curb and stayed up until sunrise, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. We sold the house 3 months later. The real estate agent said the new owners were excited about all the potential upstairs. I didn't say a word about the sealed door. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear static. It's always the same soft hiss, like something small trying to reach through a distance that isn't really there.